You've heard of Skid Row. Not the 80s band, but the poverty-stricken section of Los Angeles that's become known for homelessness, addiction, and life on the margins. But my guess is you've probably never heard of Poverty Row. Poverty Row was a nickname given to a collection of tiny, independent movie studios scattered around Hollywood from the 1920s through the 1950s. These weren't exactly the glamorous backlots of MGM, Paramount, or Warner Brothers. Those studios were out there spending fortunes to create movie magic. But just a few blocks down the road, Poverty Row was doing the exact opposite. These companies specialized in making movies as quickly and cheaply as possible. They rented modest sound stages, recycled sets and costumes over and over and over, stretched every dollar they had, and sometimes would shoot an entire feature film in less than a week. Sometimes these little studios were little more than empty warehouses with black painted walls. Bare-bones production spaces where a determined filmmaker could walk in with a script, a handful of actors, and just enough money to keep the lights on for a weekend and actually make a movie. Now, were these good movies? Honestly, rarely. Poverty Row gave birth to countless B-movies. It's where aspiring actors and directors learned their craft, where independent producers chased impossible dreams, and where aging Hollywood veterans found one last chance to stay in the business. By the mid-1950s, the classic Poverty Row studios were disappearing as Hollywood was changing. But the spirit of Poverty Row never really went away. The major studios continued making prestige pictures, while filmmakers outside of that system rented whatever soundstage they could afford, scraped together financing, and made movies any way they could. After all, even if a movie wasn't a blockbuster, there was still some money to be made, and people had to work. And if there's one filmmaker who embodied that spirit, it was Edward D. Wood Jr., better known simply as Ed Wood. Ed was a writer, producer, actor, and perhaps, above all else, an optimist. He was also an alcoholic and sometimes cross-dresser. He dreamed of becoming the next Orson Welles, but he had almost none of the money, resources, or filmmaking experience that dream required. He operated right in the heart of Hollywood, geographically speaking. But professionally, he existed on its outer edges, in a parallel Hollywood, populated by hustlers, hopefuls, forgotten actors, eccentric personalities, and bargain basement filmmakers all trying to catch lightning in a bottle. He made movies however he could. He borrowed money, most of which he probably never paid back. He recruited friends instead of hiring professional actors. He reused old sets. He shot scenes before permits became a problem, and somehow finished feature films on budget that even low-budget filmmakers considered impossibly small. An actor flubs a line? No problem, leave it. A gravestone falls over. Keep rolling. Somebody walks into the frame by mistake. Hey, film is expensive, we're moving on. Ed Wood's best-known films were Glenn or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, and of course, Plan 9 from Outer Space. When those movies were released, they weren't celebrated. They were mostly ignored. And the critics who did notice them pointed out those wobbly sets, those continuity mistakes, the awkward dialogue, and the cheesy homemade special effects. By almost every traditional measure, Ed Wood was considered a failure. He died in December 1978, broke, recently evicted from his apartment, never knowing that just a few years later, people all over the world would become fascinated by his work. Ironically, everything that critics hated about his movies, is exactly what the audiences came to love. There was never any irony in Ed's filmmaking. He genuinely believed he was making great movies. He never winked at the audience. He simply just kept creating. Just kept moving forward. Today, Ed Wood has become something much bigger than a cult filmmaker. For many people, he became the patron saint of independent filmmaking. A reminder that passion and determination sometimes leave a bigger legacy than perfection ever could. Like a lot of people, I discovered Ed Wood through his late 50s movie Plan 9 from Outer Space, the, quote, worst movie ever made. And when I heard about it, of course I needed to watch it. And instead of finding some boring disaster, I found something endlessly entertaining. And then I started to read about it. Where was it filmed? Who were these people, these strange actors in this film? How did this bizarre little movie come together? Before long, I wasn't just researching Plan 9 anymore. I was now researching an entire forgotten corner of Hollywood. That rabbit hole led me to Rudolph Gray's incredible biography, Nightmare of Ecstasy, to abandoned filming locations, to stories about the mysterious Church of Ed Wood, to forgotten rental stages like Quality Studios on Santa Monica Boulevard, and eventually to Los Angeles itself. A couple of years ago, while staying in Hollywood, I realized I was only a couple blocks away from the apartment where Ed spent his final days. So naturally, I had to walk over and see it. And standing there on Yucca, 2 blocks away from the Hollywood Walk of Fame, catty-corner to a 7-Eleven, it struck me. Ed spent his entire life surrounded by Hollywood, yet completely outside of it. And that's the version of Hollywood I find most fascinating. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Joe Parisi. This is the Odd Podcast. This episode is called Hollywood's Fringe, the world of Ed Wood. There are plenty of podcast episodes out there that spend hours breaking down Plan 9 from Outer Space. I've listened to many of them. That is not what today's episode is all about. Today we're exploring Ed's world, the forgotten Hollywood that he inhabited, the colorful people that surrounded him, the places where he made his movies, and the mysteries that still remain, along with the people who have spent decades preserving his legacy. Now, my guest today didn't set out to become one of those people. In 1992, after moving to Hollywood from Seattle, Bob Blackburn attended this Ed Wood Film Festival that he heard was going on. And one of the things that was screened during that festival was this documentary film all about Ed's life. Ed Wood's widow, Kathy Wood, appears on screen during this documentary. And as Bob's sitting there, suddenly he recognizes her. He's like, wait a minute. That's my neighbor in my apartment building. And it was. This remarkable coincidence ended up leading to a friendship that lasted until Kathy Wood's death in 2006. And along the way, Bob became one of the foremost caretakers of Ed Wood's legacy and one of the people now best qualified to tell the stories behind the man. Here's my conversation with Bob Blackburn. Bob, right out of the gates, I gotta ask, what is your favorite Ed Wood film and why?
I woke up early the day I died. It was a script that Ed wrote over, I don't know how many years. When I first saw it was after I'd met Kathy Wood, and she was my neighbor. And eventually she trusted me enough to show me the script as well as the manuscript for Hollywood Rat Race. They were kept in a little suitcase up in her hall closet. And eventually in 1997, the film got made. And it played some film festivals here in Los Angeles and Toronto. but it never got a wide distribution. The company that produced it went bankrupt, and it never got the distribution. So it's really difficult to find. It stayed true to Ed's script. There's no dialogue, but there's plenty of sound, if that makes sense. And it stars Billy Zane. And I have to qualify that because you're probably wondering what's my favorite Ed Wood film that Ed actually made. And I totally get that. And I wouldn't have to go with Glen or Glinda, and with Plan 9 a very close second behind Plan 9 or Glen or Glinda. I'm sorry, I get confused very easily on the phone.
One thing, Bob, that you will learn about me real quick is that I am very fascinated with Hollywood locations, filming locations and real life locations that hold some significance to these topics that I am interested in. And I have to ask, where exactly was the apartment located where you were living when you realized Ed Wood's widow, Kathy Wood, was your neighbor?
Franklin and Cahuenga. I literally right now, I moved next door to they remodeled the apartment building that Kathy and I were both living in. In fact, it happened in 2006, right when she had to go to the hospital and eventually died. And they were moving everybody out of that building because they were going to tear it apart and renovate it. They weren't going to tear it down, but they had to get to the electric and the plumbing because it was built like in the 1920s. And I moved next door. The property owners owned a smaller 2-story apartment, and I live literally behind the Yucca Street apartment that Kathy and Ed Wood used to live in.
Oh, wow. Yucca. And that's the final apartment they lived in where they were evicted just days before he passed away.
Right. When they got evicted from, and I still to this day don't know exactly what year they moved in there. I know it was in the 70s, but I don't have any rent receipts from the early years, like 72 or 3 or 4. I have some rent receipts from 1977, 1978 when they were, arrears in their rental payments and stuff like that, which of course eventually forced the eviction in December. But they were by that point already 6-7 months behind on the rent, which back then was only like $150 or $170. But if you prorate 70s, money equivalent to today's money, it still was like about $1,000 a month. So they were effectively between $7,000 and $8,000 behind in their rent before they were evicted. But anyway, that's where I live. Currently living. Been here for moved here in '89, so 37 years, I guess it would be now.
That apartment on Yucca, that is the one place in the world of Ed Wood that we're going to talk about today that I have personally visited. I was out there 2 years ago, and I was staying in a hotel just right up the street, and there's a little coffee shop down on the ground floor, and I'm sitting there, and I'm looking out at these little, I guess, apartment buildings, very, very cool, like pastel colored. And there was a sign on it with like a phone number for like their leasing office, and it said something Yucca Apartments or something along the lines of that. It had the word Yucca in it. I'm like, wait a minute, Ed Wood's last apartment.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Ed Wood's last apartment was on Yucca. I remember that because I'd done a lot of research, and I pull it up on my phone, and I was 2 blocks from it. So I'm like, I'll be back, guys. I tell my wife, I'm like, I just need to run down the street for a few minutes, and yeah, I just walked down there, stood there outside that 7-Eleven across, next door, and it was just like, wow, this is it. They were evicted, and then staying on a friend's couch, and 3 days later, he was dead in that friend's apartment.
Yeah, Peter Coe up in North Hollywood. Yeah,
just incredible.
Yeah. And that's actually, that apartment's been renovated now, and it's the AMDA, which is American Music Academy of Drama and Arts, or something like a FAME kind of a school for young, entertainer, professionals, theater, drama people, that is down farther on Yucca Street. But it's one of, and the building next to me that Kathy and I used to live in is now a dormitory for the AMDA kids who are all aspiring actors and, content providers, I guess you would call them nowadays.
So when you met Kathy, Ed had been dead for roughly 14 years.
78, 88, 92. Yeah, it would have been 14 years. Yeah.
So after all that time had elapsed, Did it seem that she had finally found some stability in her life? Because, of course, her life
Hmm.
while she was married to Ed was full of
Hmm.
chaotic and traumatic situations, evictions, homelessness, alcoholism. Was she doing okay in her later years, or at
Yeah,
least
I
better?
think so. Yeah, she was on Social Security. She had Section 8 for her apartment, which was helping with the rent. There had been, she had been in contact with Rudolph Gray. I know you wanted to get into
Hmm.
Rudy a little bit here in a minute, but Rudolph had been out here to L.A. to do the interviews for the book, and he befriended Kathy and helped her a little bit. I don't know if he slipped her a little bit of money here or there. He could have. I think he also facilitated when the Incredibly Strange Film Show taped her for the interview segment for the UK television show, which was the one that I saw that had her being interviewed when I went, oh, I think that's my neighbor. And so, yeah, and she had a series of doctors. She had like a cardiologist, and she had friends in the building. And I mean, they had lived here, in the Yucca apartment. So she had a few friends that lived in the neighborhood in, a couple of apartments, not in the actual apartment building she was living in, though she did have a few friends there. But she had friends in the neighborhood, and everything was in walking distance for her, the supermarket, and the bus was just a couple blocks away, so she could get to doctor's appointments and things like that. So, yeah, I would say she was comfortable. Plus, she had one of their dogs, um, McGinty, kind of a small poodle-ish kind of furry ball of craziness, I guess you'd say. There was actually a dog that they had kept. There was one of the dogs that they put in at the vet when they knew they were going to be evicted from their apartment. They had like 2 or 3 dogs at that point. And this is one that was still living all those 14 years later, after she'd been, evicted with Ed from New Park. And when I met her in 92, the dog didn't pass away till early or late 1993. So it lived another year after I, was going to her apartment to sit around and chat and, visit and all that kind of good stuff. Like a good neighbor. I was like State Farm. I was there.
She never saw the success or, fan adoration while Ed was alive. She was there for a front row screening of some pretty dark times, lots of struggle.
Mm-hmm.
What did she make of all this, that suddenly, like, he's this cult hero after he passed away, broke, homeless, and miserable?
Yeah, well, she basically told me that Ed would have wallowed in the attention. He would have loved the attention,
Oh, I'm
especially
sure.
when the movie, was produced and came out and everything. So she said he would have loved it. Would have been a resurgence for his career. He would have gotten to work making, more movies, or he would now he'd be able to knock on somebody producer's door and maybe get a meeting, So she felt bad that he didn't live long enough to see that, even though some people have said that he was aware of a film festival in New York in the in 1978, like a month or two before he passed away. I think one of the Lugosi biographers, either Bob Kremer or Bajarski, mentioned to him that there had been a fan like film festival back in New York with some of his movies and stuff. So he was starting to get that recognition, and this actually predated the Golden Turkey Award mentioned. So I think somehow he was a little bit aware that there was like a little bit of some notoriety, I guess would be what it would be. So.
I'm curious about kind of this alternate Hollywood that Ed operated in. This fascinating cast of characters that he surrounded himself with that were kind of on that same level, not really ever mainstream people, with the exception of Lugosi. But, Criswell, Vampira, Tor Johnson, Bunny Breckenridge, Paul Marco, Conrad Brooks. It's
Mhm.
truly this alternate Hollywood. And I'm just curious, with everything you've learned since this weird little journey began, who from the Ed Wood universe do you find most fascinating or maybe even most mysterious?
Boy, that's a tough question. I would have loved to have met some of those people. When I did go to that film festival, they did have some of the people that had worked or known Ed were still alive. Vampiro was there. Paul Marco was there. Forey Ackerman was there. Stephen Apostoloff was there. Balda Hansen was there. And one or two other people. I know Conrad was there too. But once I got to know Kathy a little bit, and this was, like a year or two after that, and I helped to get the lawyer to, deal with the people making the Ed Wood film. But Paul Marco was still in her circle, so I became friends with Paul through Kathy, and then David Ward, who most people kind of really don't know, but he was a really good friend of Ed's towards the end of Ed's life, the late 70s and stuff. They met at Kenny Duncan's wake. David Ward was a big Western fan from New York originally, but he loved Westerns and the old horror movies and stuff. And
Was he in any of the films that people would know him from a role?
The Cocktail Hostesses. Well, because Kenny died, I think 81 or 82. I can't remember when. No, it would have been early 70s. I'm not a researcher. I don't know, but this was when Ed was starting to work for Stephen Apostoloff. So David always wanted to get a SAG card. He was a big, huge film buff, and he would go over to Ed and Kathy's on Friday nights, and they'd watch movies together, and they'd try and outdo each other. Like, oh, there's so and so who, a bit part actor in an old Western, and they would, try to remember what other movies that person might have been in and stuff. So he and David hit it off, and Ed got him a couple of background acting jobs in a couple of the Apostoloff films and stuff. So, and David was one of the people that stayed true friends with Ed and Kathy when they were evicted. In fact, Ed loaned David Ward the copies of his own personal paperback books that he had saved over the years for safekeeping, and eventually David returned those to Kathy, who then loaned them to Rudolph Gray when he was writing Nightmare of Ecstasy. So there you go. Hopefully I answered something there.
No, for sure. So you became friends with Paul Marco. For anybody listening, if you don't know who that is, he was in 3 of Ed's films where he continuously played the character Kelton the cop. So he was in Plan 9, Bride of the Monster. Where else was he?
Bride of the Monster and the Night of the Ghouls. He actually had the lead almost in Night of the Ghouls, which finally saw a release a few years ago. That was the one that got held up in a lab because Ed could never pay the processing bill, and then eventually Wade Williams, I understand, paid a processing, the lab bill, and ended up with it, or Rudy, or one of the people associated with that. It could have been Wade. He pretty much laid claim to everything. So
I'm glad you brought that up because Wade Williams is somebody I specifically wanted to ask you about. For everybody listening, explain to the audience who Wade Williams is and what his significance is to this whole bizarre Ed Wood story.
Well, as far as I know, it was a film fan from a young age, and he started at a young age collecting like 35 millimeter prints of his favorite films, whatever it was. And that turned into kind of a cottage industry for him where he would lease them out or, whatever. And eventually he fell under the sway of Ed Wood and ended up claiming copyright on some of the Ed Wood films. He would change something in like the credits. He would put something different in there. So that would allow him to claim that version of Plan 9. as being the copyrighted version because he would then get the copyright for that version. And that was then he would go after other people that were, showing Plan 9, the original type of thing. And it's something that I really don't know a whole lot of. I do have a receipt from Wade to Kathy, or that Kathy Wood got paid some money for whatever rights she may or may not have had in Plan 9. He was just trying to cover all his bases. And I think he paid her like $1,000, like in would have been 1981 or 82, after Ed had passed away, and she was like, the legal heir supposedly at that time. But I think he was just trying to cover his bases. But he passed away a couple of years ago, and a lot of us in the world of Ed Wood thought, well, that's all good and done. No more have to worry about that. But he had a couple of friends who were twin brothers, I guess, who are now his inheritors, and they've also been going after people. So I really don't know.
So ownership of these films, it's a little murky to this day, even with that going on. Like they might kind of own a version of the film. Is that
right?
accurate?
Right. Well, yeah, but like like any writer, producer, director type of person like Ed considered himself, he was not the one that put his own money into the films. He would sell pieces of the film to investors. So theoretically, Ed, he might own the intellectual copyright to some of this kind of stuff, like the script or, whatever. But it's just like Warner Brothers owns the Batman franchise, or Disney owns the so-and-so franchise. The director, writer of that particular movie is not going to be the owner of that particular movie, correct?
Right.
So we don't. This is one thing that I'm one half of Kathy's estate. The other half was her entertainment lawyer, Bob Weinberg, who has been very ill health recently, the last couple of years. But we never have made any claim for any of the films. The only movie that we were really involved with was I Woke Up Early the Day I Died. Everything else is basically, it's either public domain, which they all could be at this point, or, other people like Kathy said that she saw Ed sell the rights to Ed to Reynolds for $1. Dollar bill, and she got so pissed at Ed for doing that. So, and then Wade Williams comes along, 20 years later and gives her some money for her quote unquote rights to, just so that she wouldn't file a nuisance lawsuit or something like that.
Yeah, I guess he could get her to sign something in exchange for a payment, and then that's one less person I have to worry about potentially coming after she signed away her right to do that.
Exactly, yeah.
Very interesting. I personally don't understand it. To me, the whole thing just seems kind of predatory and, quite frankly, a little bit sleazy, and like they are professional loophole finders. But that's just me, and that is just my opinion. But as you learn very quickly when you start researching Ed Wood, this is a world full of interesting and unique characters, and that leads me to my question about the next interesting, unique character, and that is the guy that wrote the book, Nightmare of Ecstasy, which is kind of known as the Bible for all things Ed Wood, Rudolph Gray. And this guy researched this book for a decade or more. It was a huge project. It's out there. Everybody loves the book. But the author has seemingly completely pulled away from the Ed Wood fandom, and it just seems like there's a story there. This guy wrote the book that people adore. He's the authority. People would love to pick his brain, and he doesn't seem to want anything to do with that. So, to your knowledge, what's the story with author Rudolph Gray?
I just think he's got a little burr under the bonnet because the book came out. I know he made some money also from the Ed Wood film because the script is basically based upon his writing. So
he's got an IMDb credit for that movie.
Yeah. So I do know that. Now, he was friends with Kathy, and I don't know if he ever thought of down the road that he might end up befriending her more kind of like as a son or as a, I think he got pissed off at me personally because became close to Kathy. And I think I usurped the role that I think he thought he might have had potentially down the road. I have no idea. I'm reading, tea leaves on that one.
Sure.
But we did. He actually signed a small contract with Kathy Wood that I found in her Bible that she had in her little tiny book section. And in this little contract, he agreed to split the profits of the book with her 50-50. And when I found it, I asked her about it. She said, "Oh yeah, I forgot about this," and got it to Bob the lawyer. And Bob sent a nice letter to Rudy saying, "Oh, by the way," and he ended up cutting a check for Kathy. And so I think he was pretty pissed. Plus, Kathy had loaned him the books that Ed had given to David Ward when they were evicted from their apartment. Kathy, when she got them back, she loaned them to Rudy for some of his research. You'll see them listed in the back of Nightmare of Ecstasy. And also, she loaned him Ed's Angora sweater, the one that was the last one that he had that when they were evicted from the apartment was in that small suitcase that they were allowed to take with them. And so Bob, the lawyer, wrote the letter to him and said, "Oh, by the way, Kathy would like all the books back and the sweater." And he got really pissed off about that, thinking that they were a gift, quote unquote. And so that's why he would be mad at me personally, I think, or the estate, Kathy's estate, I think he took that personally.
Mm-hmm.
But why he doesn't, and I mean, he's done a couple things. He did a film festival, was part of a film festival about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago that Joe Blevins, who does the blog, went back to New York for, and tried to introduce himself to Rudy, but Rudy was being cold a little bit, I guess would be a fair way to say it, and didn't really, was being a typical New Yorker. Apologies to all New Yorkers, okay? Don't want to get in trouble. And, I don't know why. One or two people in my group, I have a Facebook group. It's a private Ed Wood Jr. Facebook group, and I'm glad you're part of it. I know you are. And I think one or two people in the group have been in contact or are in contact or were in contact with Rudy, because I got an email from him about a year or two ago when I actually posted a copy of that check that he sent to Kathy for the payment for the Nightmare of Ecstasy book. And he sent me an email saying, I don't want you to see any of my stuff in your Facebook group, blah, blah, blah. And so I don't think we're friends, to be honest with you.
See, I just wondered, I didn't know any of that history between you and him and where things stood with Kathy asking for stuff back. I didn't know any of that until just now.
Yeah. Most people don't. Yeah.
And I figured it was totally plausible that after a decade of, being in the trenches working on this book, when he finally hit the finish line, he was like, okay, on to something new. The very first episode of the show I ever did, my guest was a guy who was kind of the star of a documentary all about Toynbee tiles. His name was Justin Dewar, and I'm asking him all about Toynbee tiles, which is this weird street art phenomenon. And, this documentary went into great depth, and they followed him for a very long time. And, at the end of our conversation, I'm kind of like, hey, so what's next with this story and these Toynbee tiles and this mystery? And he was kind of like, nothing. Like, we solved the mystery. We're on to new things. I love talking about it, but I'm good. I'm done. And I kind of figured maybe something similar happened with Rudolph Gray. He found out everything he ever wanted to know, and it was just like, I don't want this to be my entire life, so I'm moving on.
Yeah, right. I've been there, done that. Yeah, exactly.
And it's not like the guy is missing. It's just that he seems to be ultra selective with what he does participate in when it comes to Ed Wood stuff. And there's really nothing to be found of him out on the internet, like just kind of off the radar individual.
Well, actually, Rudy's been, he's done some commentaries on a couple of the Ed Wood DVD releases and stuff. I think he did one for Revenge of the Dead. Anyway, but I saw him in another documentary about Ed being interviewed. They were walking around downtown New York, and they're pointing out old movie theaters where Rudy says he saw like Orgy of the Dead back in the early 70s, or as a kid or whatever. So I'm sure he still has an interest or a fondness for Ed, and I would hope Kathy, even with anything that's gone beyond that. But again, I'm not in my loop, to be honest with you.
So there's another person, kind of a somewhat similar disappearing act. I'll just kind of say. So there was this thing called the Church of Ed Wood, which is a very strange chapter in the story. Basically, a guy who was a big fan starts an online church dedicated to Ed, and the guy jumped through whatever necessary hoops to get it, fairly legitimately recognized as a church, at least as far as the internet churches are concerned. And on the surface, it seems very kooky and weird, but you read a little bit about it, and they propped up Ed, but they actually had some pretty solid teachings in there about acceptance and the importance of continuing to create despite having the odds against you and embracing outsiders. So there was definitely something remarkable there. And it was started by a guy named Steve Galindo, and he ran the whole thing.
Right.
But it seems that the whole project, which thousands of people bought into, at least to some level, it's gone dormant, and he's kind of disappeared from the conversation. What do you know about this church? And in particular, what do you know about this Steve?
0 and 0, pretty much.
Okay.
When after befriending Kathy, and once the movie came out, it seemed harmless. It's like the Church of the Subgenius, or like Universal Life Church, or like I'm going to become a minister for a day and that kind of a thing. And
right.
And I kind of saw that. I think I may have emailed him into just to kind of feel him out a little bit, and I can't remember if I got a reply or not. I mentioned it to Kathy, and she just rolled her eyes and just, they're like, oh, there's one born every minute. And, I mean, she didn't really get too involved in all the stuff that was going on in the world of Ed too much, unless I would bring it something, because she was totally not, a computer person at all. So she had no clue as to half the stuff that was going on out there, especially once the movie came out. And I know some of the people in my group are members of that church, but I really don't have any clue as to Steve or where he may be or what may have happened. I think he lives up in the Sacramento area, or Central California someplace. I could be wrong, but
there is a physical location, Bob, that I would love to pick your brain on, and it's called Quality Studios. For those of you listening that don't know what this is, Quality Studios is where Ed Wood filmed much of Plan 9 from Outer Space. If it was on a set, it was most likely shot inside this building. And what Quality Studios was back in the 50s was just a bare bones studio for rent. A crew could come and rent the place for a day, a couple of days, probably at a rate lower than most everywhere else in town. That's why filmmakers like Ed Wood used this place. And a place like Quality Studios was needed in this Hollywood ecosystem. These fly-by-night producers needed somewhere to go, and this place was there for them. It was very no frills, very bare bones. The building still exists today. It's on Santa Monica Boulevard. It's kind of like tucked away, locked away, I should say, down an alley behind a place called Gold Diggers. And this place is iconic in the world of Ed Wood, and he shot other films there too. And I'm just wondering, because I know that you have been in the building, you were there one time when there was some construction work being done, and you were able to kind of slip back there and take some photos and post online, which all of us really appreciate. But you've been in there now in its new incarnation. I think it's a different type of studio space, like for, bands to record in that. But what can you tell us about this elusive Quality Studios? Because this is another thing from the world of Ed Wood. There are very few records about this business even existing out there. So what do you know about Quality Studios?
Boy, I wish I knew more about the history of the studio. I know that it was tucked away, you're right, down a little alley between Gold Diggers, the bar where they used to go drink, and then Harvey Apartments are on the right-hand side, where sometimes some of the actors would stay. I heard a story about Captain DeZita, who was in Glinda Glinda, the guy the devil, that plays the devil in that. He was a procurer of women, and he used to have an office in the Harvey Hotel. But yeah, I just happened. I knew where it was, and I'd been by there a few times. The alleyway was open. They didn't. Now you can't even get in there. There's a metal gate, and you have to have a code, and somebody has to buzz you in, that kind of a thing. And that's not just at the building, but in the alleyway going into the building. So the last time I was down there, so I was driving by there one day, and I saw that the door to the studio was actually, there was workmen. There was like piles of lumber and some other things that I knew that they were doing some remodeling in there. And I stopped by, and I wandered in, and I had my little camera with me, and there was some workmen in there, and they kind of looked at me like, "Yeah, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I just, I know somebody that used to work in here. Is it okay if I take a couple pictures?" And they just, went about their work and didn't really care. So I snapped a couple shots, and that was about it. And when we did Harry Medved and his partner Harry Hollenberg, I think is his correct name. Well, we're making Location Land, which was for the local channel KCET, the PBS station here locally in LA, a show called Location Land, where they would go out and they would look for the various locations where films were shot. And Harry, being part of the Golden Turkey Awards with his brother Michael, wanted to. Firstly, they went up to Pioneer Cemetery up in Sylmar, and they shot some footage up there with Dana Gold, who's a comedian and also a huge Ed Wood fan. And then they invited me and Catherine Coldiron, who had written a book about Plan 9, like kind of why it mattered and why it's so goofy. And they got permission from the people that now own the studio. It's a recording studio now with different. It's all modernized. But the back room, where a lot of Plan 9, like you mentioned, the cemetery scenes and everything like that, were shot, is now like a storage for like equipment, like bass drums and this and that. The building at one time was also a band rehearsal studio, and supposedly people like Jimi Hendrix, rehearsed there before playing locally in L.A. And when we were back there, actually saw some graffiti from some old bands of, like the 90s and the 80s and stuff like that. So, but that's where they shot this Location Land episode in there. And it was just bizarre to be in the same studio where, Ed spent so much quality time, if I can use a pun there. They also used a couple other small studios in and around Hollywood. There was plenty of them back then, and I know one of your questions was going to be about Poverty Row and all of that. And I don't have that much knowledge of Poverty Row. I just know that there was a whole brand of producers, directors, and actors that were working in the margins, so to speak. One of the places that's near here in Hollywood is on the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Gower. It used to be called Gower Gulch, and that's where like a lot of the bit actors and cowboys would go there every day in the morning, dressed in their cowboy outfits and hats and guns and stuff, and then location scouts would come down and pick them up and take them up to locations out in the valleys and stuff where they were shooting, Gunsmoke or Wild West westerns or Buck Jones movies, to bring up one of Ed's favorite cowboys. So that's the whole the underbelly of Hollywood. Starts with the low rent kind of places like Quality Studios.
Do you have any idea when they ceased operation as Quality Studios?
I really don't know. I think in the 60s, probably in the mid 60s, when that's when I heard that bands like Iron Butterfly rehearsed there. Other bands of in LA during the 60s were rehearsing there supposedly. I have no idea. Somebody should do that. That would be a whole book, in my estimation, to get the whole story of Quality.
I'm a bit of a pop culture collector, and right in front of me right now, here in my studio, framed, is this piece of construction paper that says Certificate of Authenticity, so it must be legit. Right. But it says Plan 9 from Outer Space Scenery Backdrop, and attached to the piece of paper is about a 2-inch by 2-inch...
The black curtain.
Exactly. It's the black curtain that was covering the walls of this place so they could film movies and make it look like nighttime. And allegedly this was on the wall when they filmed Plan 9 from Outer Space, and now I own a little piece of it. So that is my one of my favorite pieces that I own. It's this Plan 9 from Outer Space backdrop, but just the fact that it hung on the wall in Quality Studios for all those years, and I have to assume it's legit. It seems pretty far-fetched to make something like that up. So I'm going to go with it, and I'm going to continue to enjoy it.
Absolutely.
Bob, something that I wanted to see if you knew anything about is this estate sale or garage sale discovery. Now, Ed was an alcoholic, down and out for a lot of his life, moved around a lot, faced several evictions, sold off things, to try and make ends meet or to get alcohol. So memorabilia from his life, from his career, is pretty tough to come by because so much stuff was left behind, thrown out by landlords, sold off, just discarded in Hollywood alleys over the years. Very sad that so little survives today. But apparently, at some point over the last, 20 years, maybe 30 years, there was some things bought in a Los Angeles sidewalk sale of sorts, and it ended up being a bunch of Ed's personal effects. Like maybe the person selling it didn't have any idea what it was. Somebody did, and this kind of treasure trove of items was found. Do you know anything about this? What was found? How it was come across? Anything like that?
Well, to be honest with you, I really don't know that much about that. To be honest with you, I am more knowledgeable about what we call the trunk.
Ooh, I don't know anything about that. Do tell.
Kathy even told me about the trunk. Well, the trunk was when they were living in North Hollywood and they got evicted from an apartment. They ended up moving in with Duke Moore briefly, and they had to put a bunch of their effects, personal effects, like furniture and things like that. And they had like a a small kind of a traveling trunk that, like back in the 20s and 30s, people would go on the overseas thing and they'd have a trunk with their clothes in it or something like that, right? And so they put a trunk that had a lot of scrapbooks, Ed scrapbooks, some film, a bunch of other personal items into Beacon Storage up in North Hollywood. And they could not pay the rent on the storage unit. They were having hard enough time, paying the regular rent. And eventually, the items got sold at auction. Kathy was very upset because she said that among the things that were in there was like her her record collection, Glenn Miller 78s that she had saved. And, here's just another thing that Eddie screwed up. I lost all my records, and I had a silver squirrel fur coat. Like, it wasn't mink, it was squirrel. And she lost it, and she was so upset. And she said, and our family Bible, my mom had given it to me, and blah, blah, blah. And she said that they had an auction. I mean, they got notices from the auction company, like, if you're behind in the rent, if you don't, pay up the rent, we're going to sell it all at auction. And I don't know what year the auction would have been, probably in the mid to late 70s. Kathy said that a woman bought the family Bible and got her contact information and called her and said, I felt bad because, I thought you might want this. And she returned it to Kathy. Now, I never saw it, so I don't know what Kathy ended up doing with it. But there was this trunk of memorabilia, literally. And I heard that it ended up in the hands of a collector down near Long Beach. Now, when I met and befriended David Ward, David told me that he and Mila Vampira and another person whom I can't remember whose name was, who was a film fan who knew about this trunk and was friends with the owner of the trunk, who's a movie collector who actually knew what this stuff was. They went down to Long Beach and they saw it. And David Ward remembers seeing a Life magazine with Kenny Duncan on the cover riding a horse in Tokyo, like after the war, like in the 50s or something. I don't remember, but that's what David Ward remember. Eventually, this trunk went to a collector back in, I think, North Carolina or South Carolina, well-known film cult movie buff collector. He passed away a few years ago, about 10 years ago now. It could be a little bit longer. And his widow decided to sell off his collection through an auction house based out of the East Coast. And we heard about this, people in the world of Ed Wood, and they showed there's pictures. You could probably go online and actually see photos of some of the items that were in there, the scrapbooks and other items, personal items of Ed. And the auction estimate was like, it could go as far as up to $25,000. That was kind of where they were. The opening bid was going to be, I think, $7,000 or $8,000, but they estimated it would go up to $25,000 because it was being sold with a bunch of other lots of, from this collector's collection. And I was thinking about bidding on it myself. When Kathy passed away, she left a little bit of money from the Disney people that she got paid to Bob Weinberg, her lawyer, and myself. And so I was thinking about bidding on it, and I was watching the live auction as it was going up, and it started at $7,000, went up to $8,000, $9,000, whatever, in increments of $500. And eventually it sold for only like, I think, $13,000 or $14,000. It fell below what they thought it would get. And I, of course, had no idea who bought it. It's an anonymous bidder, and unless they come forward, we're never going to know. Turned out it was Jason Insulaco, who was the grandnephew of Paul Marco, bought it.
Wow. And Paul Marco, reminding everybody, great friend of Ed and Kathy Wood. That's incredible that he ended up with it.
So I did not, it could have been Johnny Depp buying it, or it could have been a collector in Europe and just was going to throw it in their private collection. Well, it turned out it was Jason. Jason contacted me after he'd gotten it. He had to pay, the fee and the buyer's fee and the seller's fee and the shipping fee to get everything back out here to LA. And he called me one day and he told me that he was the one who won it, and he had a few things that he wanted me to see, to check out. And among them were some of these scrapbooks and a program from Autonetics, which was the military aviation company that Ed, for about a year, was shooting industrial films for down in Orange County. And so among that stuff was a lot of these treasures that I don't. And Jason's also the one that found the film. Now, it wasn't part of the trunk, but he found the film for Final Curtain, and he and a partner found it. Now, this was what was found in a garage sale or a sidewalk sale. And how they came across it, I'm not exactly sure, but he and a partner paid for it to be redone, and it's been exhibited and shown, and we showed it actually at the movie theater here in Hollywood for Ed's 100th birthday back in 2024, part of one of the programs and stuff. So there are these things that are still floating around out there. Now, the commercials I saw, though, they actually had some of those commercials at the Ed Woodathon that I went to in 1992, where I saw all of Ed's films, but they also had these commercials. And they had like Kenny Duncan's Remington commercial, and so the commercials have been out there for a while, as far as I know.
I've not watched any of the commercials. Are they normal? Are they decent? Like, was he good? He was perfectly competent at that.
No. They're like generic. They're like from the 50s. Right. And they basically,
right.
A little bit of sleight of hand camera work and stuff. And the thing was, they could be sold to any, like the shoe store in Baltimore, or a shoe store in Detroit, or a shoe store in Wichita. It's like generic, insert your company's name here kind of a thing. And they're all short. They're like 15-second or 30-second spots.
Huh.
And they're like billboards. Like where you would insert, in radio, billboard, right? So there would be, you'd drop the sponsor name in the hole in the middle, and that would be it. And I think there was like 4 or 5 of them for like men's clothing and something else. I can't remember what else, but
I'll be darned.
Yeah, but they're out there. They're of interest, to Ed Wood fans. So it's something I think he might actually go, oh, okay, seen him once. That's all you need to, got him. It's done. Check that off the list, kind of thing.
Wow. I mean, he was a guy that just scraped together money to do this stuff any way that he could. He would rent these cheap sound stages like Quality Studios, made this stuff fast and cheap. Mm-hmm. And, he was not the only person doing this. This wasn't unusual. No. I mean, to this day, there are people in the entertainment industry that work in this way. They're kind of on the fringe of the main system. Mm-hmm. But it's just that he caught on somehow after the fact. I don't know how to describe it.
Oh, yeah, way after the fact. I mean, because he certainly wasn't a mainstream movie maker during, the 50s. And, I mean, it probably his heyday was working for Stephen Apostoloff, writing scripts and things like that. So, I mean, he was a writer. I mean, I'm more impressed, to be honest with you, with his writings than I am with the films. I love the films, but I find something very special about his writing. He was prodigious. He wrote so much. I mean, I've put out over 100 short stories and about maybe 50 or 60 articles. Now, these were the ones he wrote within about a 4 or 5 year span from the late 60s to 1973, 74. And then, of course, the novels, and he wrote, I don't even know what the count would be, 50. Some people say it's as many as 100 novels that he, would go in and pound out in a night, sitting there drinking and smoking and typing away at the typewriter for 24 hours straight. That's possible. Kathy said that he was a quick typist, a fast typist, and sometimes he dresses Shirley, to be writing, that kind of thing. So he found his muse in himself, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I didn't really get into the cross-dressing much on this episode, but I mean, just to put out there that, I mean, he liked to cross-dress, and he kind of had this alter ego when he would put on the woman's clothing that he called Shirley, referred to himself in that
Right.
form as Shirley. And he had a thing for Angora, which is like a very, very
Absolutely.
soft, fuzzy material. It's a very cool material. And he liked these Angora sweaters. And as you mentioned earlier, but I want to reiterate that, the last one that he owned that went with him when they were thrown out of that apartment right before he died, you now have it.
Yes, I do. It's in a closet about 5 feet from me right now as we speak, along with my share of the paperback books that they saved when they were evicted from the apartment. When Kathy passed away, she left all those books to Bob Weinberg and myself, and we divvied them up. One for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. And we had to sell Bob's copies about 2 years ago to help pay for medical treatments. And I was really surprised at what a couple of these books. Now, most of them are actually autographed by Ed or inscribed. That would be a better way to put it. Like from the private library of Edward D. Wood Jr. Sounds highfalutin, but I love it.
Right, right.
And so I found a PBA galleries up in the Bay Area who specialize in, like writing, basically, like from the beatniks to old maps or whatever. They specialize in literary kind of things. And found a person up there, and I sent them all copies of Bob's books, and they were sold over 3, I think, different auctions. And I was amazed. We got between the starting opening bid for all of the books was $750, and there was only one that didn't sell at that rate. So we got at least the minimum of $750 to a high of close to $4,000 for one of the books. So I was more than blown away by that, and of course the money helped Bob with his medical bills and stuff.
So some of that has been some of the stuff that he kept has been sold off. You still have a lot of the stuff. You've got the sweater, you've got some books and some other personal effects. I know Kathy left you kind of a suitcase.
Right. Well, I have that suitcase, and that's the one that they took with them when they were evicted. Now going back to the trunk, part of what was in the trunk was a smaller suitcase that matches identical to the one that I have. It's just a little bit smaller, so it must have come from a set, like a Samsonite or something like that. But we Jason and I did a little cable TV thing with Mike Hickey, who's a member of our group, and he brought his little suitcase and I brought mine, and we put them together, and it was just like, they found each other again. It was like, cue the music.
It's incredible.
So and so I am lucky that I do have a few things, personal items. I have Ed's wallet that he had when he was, when he passed away and stuff. There, people jokingly asked me, was there any money in it? And I go, yeah, right. But there was like a couple little cards and like a calendar from 1978, a little pocket calendar with a cheesecake girl on the reverse of it and stuff. So, and I don't know why, but I saved a lot of Kathy's clothes. She was kind of petite, and I was working in theater at the time, and I felt that I would run into a costume designer, one of my plays I was working on, who's looking for costumes of, smaller sized women or even children almost, so I still have some of that, and, a little bit of here and a little bit there. So
what do you think ends up happening to this stuff down the road? Have you thought that through?
Yeah, I have a little bit. I don't have any children of my own. I've got nieces and nephews up the wazoo. I've got 5 younger brothers and sisters, and all of them have kids, and those kids, some of them have kids. So I've got like 16 nieces and nephews. I have one who is an artist, and he lives here in LA now. And I jokingly tell him that I'm grooming him to become the Ed Wood person, when I'm no longer here. And I I'm not sure what, if anything, I would do with any of the items that I own at this point. I haven't made plans to donate them to someplace. I mean, if there was
That's
like
what I was wondering. Like, are they
a
going
museum,
eventually to the such
yeah,
and such Hollywood Museum or something? You know.
I wish, but when for Ed's 100th birthday, I contacted the people here locally at the Hollywood Museum. A friend of mine is like their media person, like their PR person, and he actually set up a meeting with me and the lady who kind of runs the museum, this would have been like in October of 2024. We could have had an Ed Wood exhibit. There's not a lot of physical items that belong to Ed, but I do have the sweater. We could have got a mannequin and a womannequin and dressed up in Ed's sweater, and I had some movie posters that I purchased and the books and this and that, but they passed on it. They said, "Well, can you get Johnny Depp to appear?"
Jeez.
Seriously, that's where their head was at. Like, we want the press, we want to sell tickets, and I just was going,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, you don't get it. All right, no problem." So at some point, I may talk to the Museum for the Academy, and I know that I think there's a couple of his scripts out at UCLA at the film school out there. I could be wrong, but I think there are. And there's still a possibility of some Ed Wood projects down the road that I can't really talk about now, but there's potential for some new-ish Ed Woodian kind of things down the road. So I'll leave it at that. It's called a tease. It's a tease,
I love
right?
it. A deep tease. So, Bob, closing argument here, closing question. Is there anything you wish people understood more about him?
I just wish I would have met him, to be honest with you. Meeting Kathy, I got a semblance for Ed, and she was always conflicted. She said, "I loved him, I hated him."
Mm-hmm.
He, depending on how drunk he was, he could be the nicest person, the life of the party. You give him a few too many highballs, and he could get mean. I just think Ed is an icon for the LGBTQ community for his being out there. He was out here in California when it was still illegal to dress as a woman in public. And he would go to meetings dressed as Shirley. So I give him that, and he was a Marine. He loved the country. And, he was patriotic. He didn't smoke pot. He was like Merle Haggard, Hokie from Muskogee. So I just think we learn more and more about him all the time. And I'm kind of fascinated by him. I mean, I kind of have to be in a way, but I don't mind. It's become my life, and I certainly didn't plan on doing that. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read my memoir, which is kind of the story of how I got to you and me talking on the phone, to be honest with you. How I got to this place in my life, and I certainly couldn't have planned it in a million years.
Tell everybody the name of the book so they can go buy it.
Kathy Wood and I, or How I Went Down the Angora Rabbit Hole.
And it's available everywhere.
Yeah, Bear Manor. Yeah, it's on Amazon. You can find copies of it on eBay and stuff like that. So, it's basically my journey of finding Kathy or her finding me and me finding Ed and you.
Well, Bob, I know I speak for a lot of people in the Ed Wood fan community that we are glad that you are the person this has all happened to, because you've been the perfect person to carry the torch and keep the legacy of Ed Wood alive. And you're always so willing to share the stories that you've collected since the 90s when Kathy entered your life. And we're just so fortunate to have you on our team here. keeping the torch burning bright. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for everything you've done, quite honestly, over the last 3 decades. And it's been an honor having you on the Odd Podcast.
Thank you, Joe.
The wonderful Bob Blackburn. That book that he mentioned, once again, the title is Kathy Wood and I, How I Fell Down the Ed Wood Jr. Angora Rabbit Hole. If you're into this topic of all things Ed Wood and this fringe Hollywood stuff, check out episode 125 of the Odd Podcast, of this show right here. It was all about the amazing Criswell, who of course is in Plan 9 from Outer Space, a frequent co-conspirator of Ed Wood, and one of the earliest television psychics there ever was. So lots of fun related stuff on that episode 125. My name is Joe Parisi. There's another pop culture podcast I host in addition to this one. If you like pop culture trivia, specifically 80s, 90s, early 2000s stuff, I host a show called America's Pop Culture Trivia Show. My website's joeparisifilms.com. That's where you can find a collection of documentary shorts that I've produced and released. joeparisivoiceover.com is my voiceover website. Thank you guys so much for listening. Hope you subscribe to the show, leave a rating and review. Long live the legacy and memory of Edward D. Wood Jr. Take care, guys.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.